Hey guys, this is Alex Chamberlin, and this is another low budget iPhone video with some good content though, so stick around. Today we're going to be talking about the 2018 Ibis Ripmo, and we're just going to focus on the frame. The components really don't matter when you're doing an initial impression or talking about how the bike actually rides, because you can change out every single component, but you can't change out the frame if we're talking about the frame. So we're just going to keep it simple and talk specifically about the Ibis Ripmo frame, and I might include the shock. So the one thing you really should know about this bike is its versatility. This is probably the most versatile mountain bike I've ever ridden or owned. I can't even think of another bike that's as versatile on the market. Maybe we're talking about like some Orbea Rayon. I don't know, haven't ridden it, heard it's versatile. But basically that's what I want to bring home to you guys. This bike will feel good on almost any trail you take it on, whether it be a flow trail, mellow trail, fairly flat, or the steepest thing you've ever been down, like straight loam, drifting. This bike just feels good everywhere I've taken it. It might not be the best in every situation, but I've been, let's say it's 95% of the way there in every situation I put it in, and that's what really matters to me. Before this, I wanted a short travel trail bike and then a long travel 29er, and I still kind of want an XC bike just because I kind of want to race XC at some point again. But for a do-it-all machine, I think this is kind of the pinnacle of what you can get on the market right now, and yeah, super happy with it so far. But I'm gonna dive into some of the positives, and I even struggled to really find some negatives of this bike. I nitpicked so hard to find any negatives at all, but I'll get to those at the end of the video, so stay tuned for that. So some of the positives. This bike is probably the most phenomenal climber I've been on. And let's say above a straight up cross-country bike that weighs 21 pounds, I think this is one of the best climbing machines out there. It soaks up every little bump as you climb, and it's insanely efficient. There's pretty much zero bob while standing or seated, and I don't know, you can't fault this bike's on the climb. It is so good in my opinion, and yeah, I just can't even imagine a bike getting better. I thought the Yeti SP55 was the best pedaling bike for a long time, and I've been so impressed with this. And that's not just saying it because it's mine, but look at all the other reviews out there, they agree as well. And then another thing with that versatility is it always feels at home. Every trail you take it to, it feels right there. It doesn't feel like it's too much bike. It doesn't feel like it's too little bike. It plows through rough stuff with the best of them, and then it's really efficient when you get to those flow trails, when you really try and pocket a really tight corner. It feels pretty good. And then if you have to sprint because it's a flatter trail, and I'm talking about like more UC trails, like I don't know, everyone's heard of Mailboxes or Magic Carpet. Those two trails, like, this bike still does fine on, even though it's a long travel 29er. Long travel in air quotes, because it's only 145. But I will say I do have a 170 mil fork on it. But the suspension is so good in the back that I kind of feel like I need the 170 fork. When I first started riding this bike, I just had the stock settings from my Enduro on the fork, and I needed to add so much compression because I felt like I was going so much faster, or maybe there wasn't as much travel in the rear, so I was using more front, or had more weight on the front. I'm not really sure, but yeah, honestly, the bike feels pretty neutral being 145 and 170, and I've been pretty happy with it. And that kind of brings me, I know 170, 145 sounds pretty extreme, but something I like about this bike is the geometry isn't too extreme. It's a long bike, so the reach is around 471 and the stack is around 621. Don't quote me on that. I will have to check my sources, and I will probably put some little caption up here in the video. But yeah, it's not too long and it's not too slack either. I think it's a 66-degree head angle with a 160 fork. So with the 170, we're probably at 65.5, which is plenty. I think when you get much slacker than 65, you start losing a lot of the versatility of the bike, and that's where it feels really sluggish on those flatter trails. So I think they did a really good job with this bike, and the bottom bracket's a pretty neutral height. They have a ton of standovers, so you can have a massive seat post. That seat tube length is really low. I know I'm only running a 160. I guess at my height, I could probably run like, I don't, if they even made a 220, I could probably fit one. So I think that's what people like about this bike. People with shorter legs or upsizing a bike, you can pretty much fit on it. And the chainstay, it's not too short, it's not too long, it's at 435, which is pretty neutral, but I'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, I feel like the geometry helps it become a versatile bike. If the geometry was too extreme, I think it'd be too catered to either downhill or uphill. So I think this bike remains neutral and it keeps it fun on most trails. And then one thing I struggle with so many bikes is cable routing. And I think Ibis dialed this cable routing. You have full tube and tied tube technology, talking about tits from Transition, if you get that joke. But yeah, it's super clean. The cables go right together and zip tie and go directly into the frame. Has a very clean cockpit setup. And then instead of the pivot, which is a DW link, which goes underneath the bottom bracket, this goes so cleanly right over directly into the rear chainstay on both sides, which I love. Like, I'm a sucker for clean cable routing, and Ibis did as good of a job as you could do as far as I'm concerned. Maybe when SRAM ETAP wireless for the mountain bike comes out, we won't have any cables and we won't have to deal with it, but for now, I'm super impressed with the cable routing of this bike. And also, one thing I don't want to dig on Pivot because they're a direct competitor to the Ibis bikes because they're both DW links. But this bike is 5.1 pounds for the frame, which is insanely light. Whereas the new Pivot Firebird 2.9 is around 7.5 pounds. And on this bike, they were able to include a threaded bottom bracket, tube inside tube routing, and room for a full-size water bottle. Pivot said they don't have a water bottle because it would weigh too much. This bike is 5.1 pounds and has a bottle, threaded bottom bracket, has all these things that add weight, and they still got it almost 2.5 pounds lighter than the new Pivot. So I would love to know what the deal is with that. But yeah, super impressed with this bike. It keeps the weight down, especially when you're running double downs or downhole casing tires. The bikes are creeping up in weight, so it's always nice to drop some weight on the frame, and yeah, you don't have to worry about it. The tire clearance is great on this bike. So I'm running 2.5s front and rear, and this bike has clearance for 2.6 tires. So not that I'm gonna run 2.6 tires, or I haven't run 2.6 tires yet, but I like the extra clearance because usually I'll scratch up the insides of my chainstays just from tire flex. So it was really nice to have that extra tire clearance so I could run those 2.5s and never really get any rub on the inside of those chainstays. Also, so we haven't really talked about how it rides. I mean, I've told you it kind of rides phenomenally in every aspect, but the suspension is not as plush as other long travel 29ers. A little reminder, it's only 145 and not 160. Which is, I'm comparing this bike to more of the 160 mil 29ers when I make that statement, but it's not as plush, so it's not as forgiving. I think you have to be kind of on top of your riding to get the most out of this bike, but it's super rewarding. I will say the first ride ever on this bike, I got a little overconfident, and the bike didn't save me as much as my last bike, which was a 160 mil 29er. It actually ended up kind of running train off the trail, but yeah, if you can stay on the bike, obviously, and really push into it and ride super aggressively, this bike rewards you so much. Speaking of that, the second day I ever rode this bike, I actually tied one of my KOMs in Santa Cruz, which to me speaks volumes for the bike because when I set that KOM, it's on one of the more popular trails in Santa Cruz. I probably won't name it because that's, I don't know, not ideal. But yeah, I rode it in perfect loamy conditions on my Enduro, as good as it could get. All the turns were amazing. You could just flow down the trail, and yeah, I set a pretty good time at that point, in my opinion. And then I come back a month and a half later on this rig, and I set the same exact time, but the dirt, and this was the second day I've ever ridden the bike, but the dirt was insanely blown. So every corner was blown out pretty much. I was drifting the entire way down. It did not feel like a race run. I was just all over the place, and I ended up tying, which was pretty insane to me. That just shows how comfortable I was on this bike right off the bat and how fast this bike can be. I can't wait till we get some moisture back in Santa Cruz and see if I can drop some of those times. But yeah, I've been super stoked. Pushing this bike feels really good. And yeah, it's been flawless for me. I even got to race a trans race out in Madeira already, so this bike's already been on 2 different continents. So I've only had it for a month, but it's got a lot of use. And I was really impressed with how it raced. We had a ton of steep climbing in that race, and it did fine there. It didn't soak up too much energy on the climbs. And then none of the descents I felt were overwhelming for this bike. So I was really happy with that. But somehow we skimmed over the actual suspension. It's supportive yet supple. So supportive meaning it doesn't give up its travel easily. So that's where I'll tell you it's not as plush or forgiving. You really gotta smash this bike to really get the most out of its travel. Basically what I'm saying is it's not a plush bike, but it feels more like a racy type bike, like very efficient. It loves to pump and it loves to hit big compressions because it doesn't necessarily bottom out in those big compressions. It's very supportive through the travel, and it doesn't really feel like you're gonna get bounced offline because it's too wallowy. So I really like that. But yeah, it's basically for me, I got on it first day and I just felt like, this sounds cheesy, but one with the bike. It just felt so natural. I communicate well with it. So that's just on a personal level. I don't know if everyone out there will, but for me, it kind of does exactly what I need it to do. It suits my style when jumping, when cornering, when going through rough stuff. It just really communicates well with me, and I really liked it so far. So if I haven't sold you on this bike already, I don't know what you're missing, but I mean, for me, I feel like this bike is great, but I wouldn't recommend it for maybe someone who wants a more plush bike or someone who wants a, I don't know, cross-country bike. This bike is still going to be set up. I think the minimum you want to put on this is a 150 fork. So obviously if you're doing lighter trail use or you want just the most light, efficient bike you can find, you might be on the 120 mil bike side of the spectrum, then this bike probably isn't for you. Or if you want like a bike with a 180 fork, 160 to 170 mil of rear travel, then this bike probably isn't for you as well. I'm sure you could ride bike parks just fine on this bike, but I think it will take maybe a slightly more skilled rider to get that done. But it's still definitely doable. But this isn't your bruiser. Like if you hear about people talking about like a Nomad V4, like it's just a brawler. It can take anything on the trail. It can hit the biggest holes in the world. Like that's what you're talking about with those 170 mil bikes. But obviously this is 145, and every bike's a compromise, so you have to compromise a little bit for all that efficiency. But this bike has been on the podium at EWS, so it's more than capable of getting a result. Okay, so I've gushed over the bike for long enough. I gotta talk to you about some negatives. A reminder, it took a lot to find negatives on this bike. But I'll have to say the first one is honestly this shock. And don't get me wrong, it rides amazingly. I have no complaints with the actual shock, but I do have a huge complaint with them selling a $3,000 frame with a base model shock. So this DPX2, the tune on it is great. I've been extremely impressed. All I did was add a volume spacer, add a little bigger volume spacer at 0.6 versus I think the other one was 0.4. It wasn't even needed. I rode the first 2 rides without a volume spacer, and I never felt it bottom out super harshly. But yeah, I tried to reduce the sag a little bit and put a little bigger spacer, and it plows even better now. So the shock has been great, but it's not a performance elite, it's a performance. So it didn't necessarily come with the low speed compression adjust, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. On a bike this expensive, it needs to have that low speed compression adjustment. I don't know. Yeah, it should be a non-issue that there's no way that bike should come without that adjustment. But maybe the benefit of that is you can't really mess it up. You kind of just set your rebound, set your sag, and the bike's gonna have a very good tune for 85% of riding conditions. But for me, I felt some instances where I would have liked to tune up some of the low speed compression. I'd like it a little bit firmer, but I'm really nitpicking there. So another one of the negatives is chain slap, but every single bike on the market has horrendous chain slap. I haven't ridden that new Stumpy, but basically I've had to cover the entire thing with mastic tape. I tried to do that little wave thing that Specialized was doing. It actually worked. I can't really hear any chain slap now. And then they have this little metal piece because the chain gets very close to it. And that was just the loudest thing I've ever heard. It actually chipped some of the paint next to it on the first ride or two. So now that chainstay is completely covered with mastic tape and it's as silent as ever. But that's just something to think about. Even if you don't own this bike, if you own any bike on the market, get yourself some mastic tape and it will help out so much. And then this is really nitpicking as well, but the rear end is 435, which I think is a great rear end length. But at a height of 6'1", and when the reaches are getting longer at 471, I would have really liked to see, actually, this is just for every bike in general, I would love to see adjustable chainstays. Because short chainstays are better for shorter riders, but the taller you get, you kind of need a more neutral riding position, and I would have loved to see a 440 option for the rear. Obviously, bike brands aren't doing that because it's extremely expensive to make a full mold just for the rear end, and it probably messes up suspension kinematics slightly. But it would have been really cool, at least on the large and extra large, to have a 440 mil rear end instead of the 435. But I do like that it's at least a 435 because, again, the pivot, it's a 430. They're stuck in the ways of you need the shortest chainstays because you can manual them. You can manual any bike on the market. Cody Kelly made a living off of manualing a rear end or a bike that was a 445 rear end. So you can pretty much manual any bike if you know how to manual. So short rear ends, they just make cornering less predictable and make you slide more. So I would have liked to see slightly longer rear end, but again, very happy with how their bike rides. At least it's not shorter than it is. And the market wants short rear ends, so whatever sells, right? And also, one thing I wanted to point out, this bike does feel a little harsh in the parking lot. It feels like it has a very stiff stroke to it. So you think that would transfer to the trail, but when you're climbing, you don't really get knocked off line. When you hit a bump, it soaks it up really well. It doesn't really upset your pedaling. And then downhill, that harshness doesn't really get transferred to you. You feel that support, that the suspension's not wallowing, but it doesn't necessarily feel extremely harsh in the pedals. But that's just something to note. Around the parking lot, I was like, oh wow, this bike is gonna be stiff. So maybe don't judge a book by its cover. Actually take it on a trail and see how it rides. And then let's say the last downside, so there's 3 downsides so far, this is the 4th. You can run a coil, but it's not the best idea. So with the Clevis designs, they're really harsh on coils and can potentially snap the shafts or where the eyelet kind of attaches to the shaft. So you can have a risk of snapping that, and also it's slightly linear of a suspension curve, so you might get some harsh bottom out. But if you aren't, I don't know, it's very hard to say things in the best light, but if you don't hit trails with massive compressions, if your trails are very chattery, and you might not be hucking things necessarily, I have heard people have been running coils on these and it makes the rear end even more supple. So there is a big benefit to running a coil on this bike, I've heard, but for me, I don't think it would work well for my riding style. But that's something to keep in mind. A coil is not necessarily meant for the bike. You can run one, but if you're a very hard charging rider or you're on the heavier side, like I'm 200 pounds, so a coil is probably not the best idea for me. But that's just something to keep in mind. So that's about it. That was a pretty long first impressions of the bike, but just a little recap, I'm pretty much in love with this bike. It's kind of like my Yeti SB6 at the time, and once you find the right bike, you don't really look at other bikes or want to switch. Like when I was on my Specialized, I was always looking for the next bike. I'm like, oh, there's something about this bike I just don't like, and I was always looking for something. But now that I'm on this, no other bike on the market really interests me, and I'm just so stoked about what I'm riding. And that's what you want to have. When you buy a bike, you want to know you made the right purchase, and you want to keep it until standards change too much or something revolutionary comes out. But hopefully I'll be able to keep this bike for a while, or potentially, since all these parts are getting worn out from my Specialized Enduro, if I could do a kind of fresh build with the XTR 12 speed down the road. That's on my mind, but keep the frame. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, I'll have a more in-depth review in a few months, because I know people are interested in kind of the bushings on the bottom and how they wear and how the bearings wear and just kind of how the frame is overall over time. So I'll get back to that in a few months. But I want you guys to look forward to a video that's coming out. I just did a comparison between downhole casing tires and exo casing tires by Maxxis, and it's a professionally filmed video. It's my first video that was very focused on high quality, so that will come out in around a week or two, and I can't wait for you guys to see it and see what I'm capable of on YouTube, because I know you guys don't really mind the iPhone videos too much, but for me, I really want to step my game up, and I can't wait to see your guys' feedback on this next video, so definitely stay tuned. If you have any questions about the bike that I didn't answer, please write them below in the comments. I usually respond to every single comment, and especially when I'm stoked about the bike, I will get all the information I know about this bike out. Just ask me about it. I can't think of everything off the top of my head, so the best way to get your questions answered is just write me below. Well, hopefully you guys stuck around. I know this is a longer video and there's not much going on. It's kind of just me holding my phone in front of my bike. But I hope there was enough information in here, and I want to close now, but if you guys see me out on the trail, always feel free to say hi. I love hearing that you guys watch the channel and are stoked about it, and that keeps me motivated to make more videos. So on that note, cheers. I'll see you out on the trails.